Welcome to Leaders in the Arena. My name is Jenny Whitener, and I'm the Executive Director for the Brock Barnes Center for Leadership at Covenant College. Leaders in the Arena is about real stories, hard-earned insights, and practical guidance from leaders doing the work of leadership in the arena. Brock Barnes Center for Leadership is focused on equipping servant leaders to faithfully build institutions and communities as a part of Christ's work in making all things new. We do that through 4 different capabilities: our Institute for Student Leadership, the Institute for Innovation and Impact, the Institute for Executive Education, and our Wisdom and Insight series, which brings me to today's program. We're just so very thankful to have our special guest with us today, Dr. John Plating. He serves as the director for the Center for Calling and Career at Covenant College and has an extraordinary background in leadership across multiple dimensions. And in fact, I'm going to ask him to start off today talking a little bit about his career journey and all the various leadership roles he's played. John?
Thank you, Jenny. Thank you. Thank you very much. It's a real, an honor to be kind of a part of this afternoon and to be with you guys. And I guess to share a little bit of my story as well, just in terms of my own background. So I do work at Covenant College. Have been here for just over 11 years, but prior to that, I was in the U.S. Air Force for 25 years. I tell the students here, I did not go to Covenant College. I went to the Air Force Academy, which was probably the start of my career journey. Just sort of getting through Air Force Academy as a 4-year institution that was really seeking to develop leaders for the U.S. Air Force going forward. And so graduated in 1989. Had back in those days, they were this is sort of the height of the Cold War era. And so anybody who was physically qualified to fly airplanes was sent to pilot training. I went to Phoenix, Arizona for my 1-year pilot training, and then immediately was brought back to be an instructor pilot as part of that. Would fly trainers, a couple different types of training aircraft for a few years, and then would transition to flying C-130 transports. Did that in Germany in the middle part of the or 95 to 2000, basically. And so for those of you who are old enough, you'll remember that kind of in the late 90s, there was a lot going on in the Balkans as the Soviet Union had collapsed and all of those sort of satellite states were splintering. And so there was a lot of upheaval. And so a lot of the things that we were doing, flying transports, was pretty heady stuff in terms of, when I say heady, I mean stuff that we were doing was getting covered on CNN, that day, basically. So it was pretty fun to be a part of that. Was flying transports there. That's where a lot of the small amount of combat experience comes from that as well. And then my career would take a shift as I would be medically pulled out of flying, but was given the opportunity to stay in the Air Force and then go back and teach at my alma mater, which was the Air Force Academy, like I said. And so the history department, I was a history major a million years ago, and they hired me to come back and teach history, but I needed a graduate degree, so they sent me to Ohio State, and I did graduate work there, did a master's and then a PhD program there, and then would go and teach at the Air Force Academy for about a decade. So that's kind of in a nutshell, kind of my background. So my leadership has sort of spanned a couple different dimensions, both in sort of operational, on the operational side of the Air Force, but then the academic side. And so the end of my career, Air Force career, was serving as basically the chief of staff for the academic mission at the Air Force Academy, which was which was about 750 personnel. About a $75 million budget. So the stuff that we were doing, so it was different in terms of lower stakes. No one was shooting at you, but it was still pretty important and pretty heady stuff. So would retire in 2014 and then came out here and started working at Covenant since then. So
Amazing.
that's my background there.
I was going to say, well, it's too bad we only have 30 minutes today because I'm sure there are many, many stories that we would love to hear around
Mm,
this really expansive background. How blessed you have been to have been in leadership roles in many, many organizations and in the military.
yeah.
Thank you for your service and
Mm,
thank you for your leadership at the Air Force Academy. I know today one of the things we talked about, because you and I have had the opportunity to be on multiple consulting engagements together, different leadership roles together. But today I really wanted us to spend some time sort of getting your perspective on how leadership evolves in
mm,
different roles. Because think of your own situation, right? So
yeah.
how does leadership evolve? How does it evolve with decision making? How does it evolve with responsibility in your calling? Like, help us understand how over time we get put into positions of different leadership roles and how we need to embrace that and what does it mean to how we lead. Does that sound like the topic
Yeah.
you signed up for
No,
today?
it does what? No. That's a really good question. Or I appreciate the way that you expressed that. Early on, even when I was, back in as an instructor pilot in Arizona, the first plane I was in, you sat side by side with your student trainee. The instructor was on the right, the student sat on the left. And that's where we joked that we would kind of turn them from pedestrians into pilots, because they would transition from that airplane to a supersonic airplane. But the thing that was pretty neat about that was, I mean, you were literally next to the person you were teaching, that you were training, and it was pretty early on. I really appreciated the one-on-one dimension of. I mean, in that case, it's teaching, but it's also leadership as well. And I always gravitated, even as I moved up in my rank and experience and responsibility. My favorite thing is being part of smaller organizations, smaller units, working with smaller groups where I can have sort of life on life connection with them. But as you increase in rank, I mean, your connection with your ability to do that. I mean, you're trying to multiply in your leadership capacity what you're doing sort of across your organization, and simply by the fact that you're a human and you're limited time and space, you can't be with everybody all the time, as you might like to. So while I might gravitate, while I enjoyed sort of the personal dimension of connecting with people and helping to try to mentor them and help them grow, I think one of the challenges was, how do you then multiply that across the organization that you're leading in a way that still sort of has your fingerprints on it, but also relinquishes, that one-on-one connection that would be there, and trying to multiply that.
Right. So, I mean, what I'm hearing you say is that at its most fundamental, basic element, leadership is about a personal relationship.
Very
It's this
much. Yeah.
one-to-one enabling growth, guiding, coaching. But
Hmm.
then as responsibilities change in scope and scale,
Yeah.
there's some adjustment that you have to do, but it fundamentally is still driven based on these personal relationships.
Hmm.
When you think about how you've enabled scope and scale, what other components of leadership beyond the personal relationship became important? What else did you have to master? What other things were important for you to take that leadership to scope and scale?
Yeah. So as you are moving up, then your influence is going to be primarily felt through the people that are directly working for you. And so, in a way, instead of being a mentor for that, pilot trainee, if you will, you're being a mentor for these next level supervisors, who then you're hoping will then take what you're doing and sort of help disseminate that. And I think what ends up happening is, you find yourself probably operating more in creating sort of an ethos in the organization. Um, I hate to use the word mood because that sounds kind of temporary, but you are, I think, as a leader, in those larger organizations, you set a tone, that is really important. And so, whatever the things are that you hold valuable, so whether it's maintaining standards, whether it's, recognizing great accomplishment, whatever it is that you find that are the sort of the hallmarks of what you gravitate towards. How do you sort of push that down so that it sort of spreads like leaven, like yeast throughout your organization? So I think that's where I'd go with that.
Yeah, I mean, so many times I remember once I was doing a leadership conference for a group of leaders for a financial services company, and we used this imagery of a drop of water
Mm.
hitting, let's say, a pool,
Yeah.
and the ripples that effect that would happen when that drop came down and hit that pool of water, and how the rings got bigger and bigger and bigger and rippled out. And I think what I'm hearing you say about reminding leaders who grow in scope and scale that the tone they set and the work that they're leading has this ripple effect in an
Mm.
organization, so that if they're optimistic, if they're setting a vision, or even the meetings that they lead, giving their direct team the tools to then cascade, being conscious that there's a cascade that's going to happen, right? I mean, and
Yeah. Yeah.
equipping that process.
Yeah. If I can, as an example, I guess, and this would be a negative example. I remember, so, okay, way back, in, it was 1996. And this was when I was flying transports in Germany. And I remember coming back from a mission. We'd been out on the road for a week. And as sort of we were wrapping up all the paperwork at the very end, we're notified that, hey, we had some sister units on our base, and there was one of the sister units was a VIP transport unit, and it flew these large, like 737 size VIP aircraft. And there were only two airplanes as part of that unit because there wasn't a lot of work to be done there. But what had happened though is that a presidential delegation, and this was under the Clinton years, Ron Brown, who was the Secretary of Commerce at the time, he brought a delegation out to interact with leaders sort of in the Balkans. And so they were all on board one of these VIP transports, and that one of those planes was missing when we got back. We got notified, hey, and the reason why it was a big deal was because, at least personally, not just because of airplanes just don't go missing.
Right.
But the other thing that was more stark about that is there were only a handful of pilots for that plane, and one of them was my next door neighbor back home. And so of course I'd been gone, got everything wrapped up, drove back home. Paula, my wife, greeted her at the door and stuff. And, of course, she was glad to see me. I'd been gone for a week. And I said, one of the T-43s is missing one of Tim's airplanes. And Tim was on that airplane. Our neighbor, Tim Schaefer was his name. And as I said that, I saw sort of this blue Air Force van driving up, and it had a notification team on board because anytime there's an accident, they send a team out with all sorts of specialists to make that kind of notification. And yeah, and the spouse, Tim's wife, came running out, and it was awful because the plane, in fact, had crashed.
Oh, no.
I mean, it was such a big deal that so my wife Paula would spend the night with Kathleen, the now widow. And in fact, President Clinton called their house that night to express his personal regret what happened, and so it was really a big deal. But the ripple effect of that was that organizationally, we were there was such a go 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 attitude at the time to make things happen, and because there was sort of this go 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 attitude, what had happened is pilots and sort of organization leaders were sort of compelled to sort of cut corners on certain things.
Mm.
So much so, like when an airplane. So sorry, I'm getting into the weeds here. I hope you don't
Right,
mind.
right.
But like the aircraft it was flying into an airport. The crash happened at a place called Dubrovnik, and there had been no approach procedure. When your airplane lands at a place, there's like a map that tells the pilot where to
Where
go.
to go?
And those things have to get approved by the DoD. And there had been no sort of thing like that. There had been sort of these privately made ones, but nothing that had sort of the DoD, Department of Defense stamp of approval on it. And again, because sort of the senior leadership had really pushed this, we need to make the mission happen no matter what. That's why corners were cut, people died, and the net effect too was that those senior leaders were all sort of removed. They were all fired just because they had been part of sort of promoting this ethic of making something happen in light of
Hmm.
sort of cutting corners to the point where safety measures were
Hmm.
overlooked. So anyway,
No,
that's a
wonderful story.
yeah.
And heartfelt. And so
Yeah,
sorry for hearing that
yeah,
happen. But it illuminates for me the importance that as leaders grow in scope and scale, they have to remember the responsibility of stewardship,
hmm
right? And so when we have that pressure to go ahead, maybe into, not dot the I's and cross the T's or whatever the
yeah,
situation was, and the risk and reward of moving ahead at that, I think there's this combination of courage and stewardship that come into play. And also where you are in an organization. Sometimes you can push back, but if you're under a command and control situation and you're told to go,
yeah.
for leaders that may not be in a military sense, and I know that you do a lot of coaching of students at Covenant. How do you help people understand, like, when do I step forward as a steward and say it's my responsibility to ensure that there's safety, or it's my responsibility to ensure that we're stewarding resources well? And how do
Yeah.
you have the courage to do that? Any advice you have there?
I guess in certain things, like for example, in that story, in retrospect, I mean, we have the privilege of hindsight now and being like, well, we totally see why that happened, but I also can see um, why decisions were made to kind of cut corners as well. And sometimes it's not so black and white. I mean, there's judgment things that come into play. And yeah, and so to answer your question, I guess I think one of the things that's important for leaders, this is where it probably becomes really critical for leaders to be in touch with what's happening, especially as they move up in an organization, to be in touch with what's going on at the lower levels of how is their messaging, how is their leadership, how's it being received. My One of my brothers worked for many years for Verizon Wireless, and um, I have an uncle who's passed away now. His name was Jack Plating, and Uncle Jack was the chief operating officer for Verizon Wireless for something like 10 years or so. And he and my brother worked for Verizon sort of as a peon. And my brother Jack and my uncle Jack, same name. My uncle Jack he regularly call my brother and be like, "Hey, what are you hearing down there? Like, what's going on? Like, how's this all being transmitted, right?" And my brother could just, because he didn't, my brother didn't give a hoot about, he's just Uncle Jack. He wasn't like anybody who's trying to impress. And so, but I think there was an example of a leader who had figured out ways to sort of know what was going on, below several levels down. And anyway, so, and how important that something like that would be to receive that kind of feedback. Yeah.
Right, right. In fact, it reminds me a couple of things that you'll hear kind of in the literature. Sometimes in the HR function, you'll hear people talk about skip level meetings, where leaders intentionally set up meetings with people one level down or a couple levels down, just to
Yeah.
kind of say what's happening, what's going on there. And in the old environment, it was kind of like leadership by walking around, like
hmm
colliding over coffee or meeting somebody in the hallway, talking about what's happening, what are you working
Yeah.
on?
Yeah.
It's a little bit harder to do that today in virtual settings. I'll
hmm
see managers and leaders kind of set up coffee meetings, just
Yeah.
touch base, kind of like wanting to understand how things are going. Last night I was at a dinner meeting and somebody was talking about how Elon Musk and his team transformed production. They had to, when Tesla was just on the brink of financial ruin, when they couldn't
mm
get production going. And in 6 months, they changed the production process to 2x. They multiplied times 2 the amount of production they were doing in the same facility. And this gentleman who was telling the story said that it was his understanding what Musk and his team did is they put a campsite on top of the manufacturing facility. And they would go down in the manufacturing facility right on the line and say, why is it so, what's happening with this rubber structure that's going around the windshield? Why is every third one not meeting quality standards? And the guy said, the robot's broken or the robot doesn't function right. Yeah. It was getting that really firsthand insight on where the problems were in the production process that they were able to say, kick the robot out. They had to actually open up a door the size of a building to remove all the robots that weren't working correctly. Anyway, go all the way, getting off my story, but
can I jump there?
Yes, it's a wonderful insight.
Because this is where too, as a leader, you've got to be open to feedback. And what is your posture towards receiving negative feedback? There's a famous story, George Marshall, Chief of Staff of the Army during World War II, famously, when he was younger in his career, he's sort of a mid to senior level leader, and he would have staff officers working for him, and he could sniff out if a staff officer was what they would call a yes man, and he would not hire yes men. He would fire them on the spot. And his thinking was, he's like, listen, I don't need anybody to tell me that my ideas are great. I know they're great. I need somebody to tell me my ideas are wrong and help me shoot them down, And so I think, what's your posture as a leader? Are you open to criticism? How are you receiving that feedback? How accurate is that feedback, et cetera? So I think, there's a lot to be said there. Yeah.
Well, it's very interesting. I think this happens in the military. I think it's called an after-action review. But my niece is in the emergency. She's a physician in the emergency room. And you'll hear physicians talk about post-mortem or post-incident. And it's an intentional reflection by the team on feedback about how this patient care or how this action was, went forward. And I think this intentionality of feedback is really important, and how as leaders we have to welcome it and remember it's a gift.
Yeah, and just to put a pin on that, because we'd call them hot wash sessions after like a mission, and you got the whole gang in the room, and it could be a large, especially if it was, I think about flying, we would fly C-130s, has a crew of, depending on what you have on board, you have a crew of about 6 or 7. And we do these night formation missions with 3 airplanes. And so you'd have all those crews together sort of afterwards, and then any other support personnel. So you could have like 50 people in the room, and we'd have these hot wash sessions, and they could be brutal because you did not, like, if you screwed something up, you got called out. And no one was like, we're all sitting around drinking beers, but it was pretty like between the eyes. And so, and so you better have your act together. But it was also, there was nobody trying to like sugarcoat anything. And so anyway.
It reminds me of some of the work by Patrick Lencioni when he talks about some of the critical elements for great teaming. As I would sense there was a high degree of commitment, high degree of trust, and then a high degree of accountability, right? That team had, that gave everyone the permission to be frankly honest about what happened, where the feedback was. And it was only with that commitment that it was across everyone.
Right.
That we got better together, right?
Yeah. And
we lose together, we win together.
Right. And it's the reason why that commitment was there, because the stakes were so high. Like, you could mess something up that could kill people. Yeah. So that's why, and now I know it's not always like that in a business setting or things like that, which is why I love this part of my career way more than it's very different. But I think that the principles hold true, though. Yeah.
Right. Good. All right. So I'm going to switch gears a little bit. I think you've helped us to understand some of these aspects of leadership as you mature in scope and scale. It's always personal, but you've got to remember that as you get broader, a higher degree of scope and scale, to continue to keep that in mind and then empower leaders and give them the resources to scale what they need to, and but stay in touch with those
Yeah.
across all levels and have this feedback mechanism. So this is all really good. In your role that you're working in now at Covenant College's Center for Calling and Career, you are helping others develop. And can you talk a little bit more about a role for leaders in enabling development, helping to find your calling?
Hmm. Um, as because I'm working, especially like one-on-one. Of course, my role is institutionally, I try to have my fingers as in as many pies as possible, just because I have my appetite is bigger than my stomach. But in working with students one-on-one, I think one of the things I've come to appreciate more and more is the value of just trying to ask good questions and really figure out what's going on in the student. And maybe not figure out, but help the student sort of figure out and help to guide them in that way. My tendency can be pretty like didactic, pretty much like this is what you need to do. That was probably John plating, I don't know, maybe 2.0 or maybe, I don't know, 1.5 or something, a decade ago or so. But especially in working with college students in this capacity and at a place like Covenant, not in a military context, I found just trying to help encourage them, coach them, give them nudges along the way, but really just trying to pull that out of them, I think, has been something that I've kind
Yeah.
of drifted in that direction. Yeah.
I really, really appreciate what you just said, because I think often leaders who begin to really take on responsibility for development or supporting an individual in their career growth, I think one of the first things you'll see with a leader who hasn't really thought through it is, what am I going to tell them?
Mm,
But the very first thing you said, John, was, what questions am I going to ask them?
mhm.
Completely opposite, right?
Yeah.
And so I think that's a wonderful word of wisdom
Mm,
that I'd like to just highlight for the group that might be listening today, is that really development starts with understanding.
mm,
Development starts with asking those deep questions and
yeah.
helping that person go through exploration. And I can see why you're so magnificent at the job that you have as director. I mean,
Brother.
because just that was your very first response,
Oh,
right?
thank
Ask
you.
those tough questions.
Yeah.
Right. Well, it's been our
Thank you.
pleasure having you today. It's great teaming with you at Covenant College and all the work that we're doing and enabling great leadership of the students of Covenant. Um, God bless you, John Plating.
Thank you, Jenny Whitener.
Take
It's a
care.
privilege to work with you. I'm grateful for this. So,
All right. Take care now.
okay.
Bye bye.
Bye-bye.